Okay, so it's been a couple weeks. We are back with Marvel's Secret Invasion event. Yes, and those of you guys who are asking, we will make a full story video at the end of this whole thing, right? We'll probably release it in time for the main Secret Invasion show that comes out. But the thing about this is kind of continuing this on, right? This sort of shows us or covers the continuing invasion of the Skrulls against Earth. Now, one of the cool things about this is we're going to get this revelation that may or may not be true. And I'm curious to see which one you guys believe. Right? I'm curious to see how you guys feel about this. But what this does is it picks up after the collapse of the SHIELD helicarrier, right? Remember, that was one of the strikes that was launched by the Skrulls. They launched a multifaceted strike against Earth. That initially they launched a strike against the superheroes by literally just crash landing a vessel into the Savage Land. And when the various superheroes had responded to it, that you ended up having them met by their former counterparts, right? And we just didn't know which one was which, right? Was the Spider-Man who had shown up in the Savage Land, was he the real Spider-Man, or was it the one that came out of the ship? We didn't really know exactly what was going on, and that was part of the confusion that the Skrulls were creating, is throwing out doppelgangers and then forcing the superheroes on Earth to actually question whether or not they were Skrulls, and then to question their teammates, right? Just kind of sowing doubt. The other part of this was them launching a traditional attack in the city of New York, as well as other places around the world, in addition to taking down SHIELD, their technology, as well as Stark Tech, right? So basically blinding all forms of intelligence on Earth. So nobody really knows what's going on, right? So when you end up having Maria Hill, who again is the current director of SHIELD in Marvel Comics, at least at the time this story is being written, when she takes off to the surface of the helicarrier, she's met by Jarvis. Now, Jarvis is historically the Avengers' butler. The fact that he's here and the fact that the attack was launched, of course, putting two and two together, Jarvis is a Skrull, which we already knew for the most part, right? He was the one that helped to orchestrate the attack that took down SHIELD and Stark Tech at the same time. But the fact that Jarvis is an inside man for the Skrulls is a big deal, because the Avengers are pretty knowledgeable about how SHIELD works. The fact that Jarvis is a bad guy here means he's basically able to bring down the Avengers, right? Which is a pretty significant moment. The other part of this is we basically switch over to Camp Hammond. Now, this requires a bit of explanation. For those of you guys who aren't really familiar with Marvel Comics, Camp Hammond is one and really kind of the main site of the Initiative. So the way this worked in Marvel Comics is that, as most of you guys know, you had Civil War. And again, we've talked about this before, so for those of you guys who are familiar with this, bear with me here for a second. When it came to Civil Wars, most of you guys know it was all fought over superhero registration, right? That if you were a person out there that had superpowers, whether you intended to use them or not, you had to register your name, your address, the whole nine yards with the federal government. Those individuals who didn't want to sided with Captain America. Those individuals who did sided with Iron Man, and this led to a giant rift in the superhero community. Ultimately, Iron Man, Reed Richards, Hank Pym, Ant-Man, those guys who were on the side of registration, they effectively won. And what they ended up doing was implementing the 50-state initiative, which was literally a government-sanctioned superhero team in all 50 states. In terms of planning, it was pretty great, right? It was pretty awesome. And the reality is I always sided with registration, because what that does is it basically holds people accountable, whereas people like Captain America didn't want to be held accountable for the things they did, right? Otherwise, they would have been on the side of registration. And so what this means is that at Camp Hammond, you have a kind of coming together of what is in effect the most capable members of the 50-state initiative. Not everybody from the initiative is here. It's basically like the top of the class, right? Like those individuals who are like in the 1% of the class, they get straight A's, for lack of a better analogy here. But they're basically gathered because no one knows exactly what's going on, or at least are not being made aware of what's going on. Now, eventually they're told by some of the individuals like Diamondback, who kind of run the initiative program in the absence of Hank Pym and those guys, and essentially saying like they don't know where the Avengers are, communications with SHIELD and Iron Man and all that stuff is down, right? Like nobody knows how to get anybody. They're literally flying blind. But then Hank Pym basically shows up out of nowhere and tells them like, there's an attack in the city of New York. This is what you've been training for. We have to go respond. Now, that's one of the things to understand. The idea behind the initiative, and it was an actual comic book line. It wasn't very good, but it was an actual comic book line. The idea was to literally train them and get them prepared so they could actually be superheroes that could help alongside the Avengers. But that's all they would really be for the most part. I mean, the ones who were like the absolute best, they would go on and join the Avengers proper. But for the most part, the Avengers Initiative program was kind of like, if we need help, we will call you, right? Until you've proved that you're a person that can actually stand on the battlefield in a meaningful capacity. The reality here, though, is that this is kind of an all hands on deck situation. And so where you have all these Skrulls who had invaded the city of New York, and they're all basically using some variation of a combination of superhero powers or just direct duplicates of superheroes, Wolverine, Iron Man, different things like that. That you do have like Vision who's here. You also have the Young Avengers, right? Now, here's the kind of caveat here, because you're going to notice Wiccan around here. When it comes to Wiccan, those of you guys who aren't familiar with him, Wiccan is ridiculously powerful, right? Like as the son of the Scarlet Witch, arguably he's more powerful than she is, depending on what era of comics you're reading and where his powers are. He is destined to become the demiurge, basically meaning he's going to be the most powerful being on Earth and quite literally one of the most powerful beings in the universe. He hasn't quite reached that point yet because he doesn't have fine-tuned control of his abilities on that scale. But this is one of those moments where basically Brian Michael Bendis invokes a character that's stupidly powerful, but you never actually see him use the full totality of his abilities. It's just kind of the way Brian Michael Bendis writes. He's very inconsistent with his writing style. But at the end of the day, of course, you have Hulkling who initially responds. Now, Hulkling is half Skrull. He's not a Hulk, right? Despite his name. I know you're like, my initial thought when they first introduced Hulkling, when I first got into him, was like, okay, we don't know his entire basis. Is he like the son of the Hulk or something like that? No, he's just half Skrull, but he is a shapeshifter and he is a cool character. But the thing about this is because he's half Skrull, he initially tries to play diplomat, right? Like, hey guys, I'm half Skrull, it's cool, you guys gotta stop, you can't do this. But one of the things to remember is the Skrull Empire as it exists now, it really takes place in the aftermath of Galactus destroying pretty much their entire homeworld, as well as a whole host of the Skrulls being obliterated themselves during the Annihilation event. So all you really have left of the Skrull Empire is basically just a religiously guided race, which is being led by their queen for the most part. And so because of that, they're really here with religious fanaticism, right? Like, we are destined to take this place. This is like our manifest destiny, essentially, and they're looking to conquer it, right? Like that's kind of what their goal is here. And as a result of that, there's no way to really bargain with them, right? I mean, when you have an individual who is guided by religious zealotry, whatever the religious figure is, that's the only person they're going to listen to. And so in the absence of that religious figure, they will believe the person that they identify with the most, who claims to speak on behalf of that religious figure. In times of desperation, people will believe what they want to believe. And in the instance of this, it's the Skrulls believing that their end is nigh. When a religious figure pops up, in the case of the Queen, and saying, I can lead us to greener pastures, they will follow her with unwavering loyalty. And that's exactly what's happening here. That's why you can't bargain with them. That's why you can't talk them down, because they believe it's their mission from their gods to conquer Earth. And so where you do have the initiative that steps in and does what they can, for the most part, they're a stopgap measure. It's sticking a piece of bubble gum on a leak in a wall, right? It's going to hold for a little bit, but they're not going to save the day. And so what this does is it switches over to the Savage Land with basically Jessica Drew, Spider-Woman. Now, previously we had talked about how the Queen was impersonating somebody. She was going forward to claim to be someone in the Secret Invasion event. This is it, right? She claims to be Spider-Woman, right? Like, she literally took on the form of Spider-Woman. Now, here's the thing to understand. There's more that goes on here than simply the Skrulls just taking on the form of a person. They have a whole process, and it's really cool. It's pretty badass. But of course, when she shows up here, she immediately takes out Echo. Now, of course, a lot of you guys may know Echo from the Hawkeye TV series. She's been around in Marvel Comics for a little while. She was never important. No one ever really cared about her. She was just there occasionally and did some stuff and was interesting sometimes, I guess. It wasn't until Marvel decided they were going to put her in the Hawkeye show that in the comics they started to elevate her. They gave her the Phoenix Force and all that kind of stuff. Here's the funny thing. People still don't care. So, I mean, she's not an interesting character, and she never was. She's not cool because she's basically Taskmaster, right? Like, she can copy the fighting styles of other people. Been there, done that, right? I mean, that's literally all it is when it comes to her character. So that's why people never really cared about her too much. But the thing about this is Jessica Drew takes out Echo immediately, like right off the bat, incapacitates her. Now, there is a reason why the Queen chose Spider-Woman above everybody else, and we'll cover that when we go into like the transformation process when the Skrulls take on the form of somebody else, because there is a huge huge motivation, and it's really, really cool. But what she ends up doing is basically traveling to see Tony Stark. Now, one of the things to know is that when the Secret Invasion event first kicked off, and like technology, really like Stark Tech and everything went offline, what it also meant is that Tony Stark's suit was not really capable of keeping his body safe the way that it previously had. He's literally dying, right? That's literally what's happening. His fever's like 102, his body's basically shutting down, and so he's trying to find a way to get his suit back up and running again. Now, the thing about this is when Jessica shows up, he's kind of like, look, no offense, girl, but like, I don't really want to talk to anybody. I have to focus on trying to find a way to fix this suit. Now, under any normal circumstance, Tony Stark would do this in an instant, right? This suit would be sorted out quick, fast, and in a hurry. But one of the things to remember is that they're in the Savage Land, right? And we talked about this in a previous video. The Savage Land is out there in Antarctica somewhere. Sure, it's been a place that's been explored and used by multiple people over the years. Mr. Sinister, Magneto, right? Like Kazar, who nobody cares about. He's basically Marvel's Tarzan, right? Like, it's been used by a lot of different people, but the technology is archaic, right? So this is basically Tony Stark trying to fix his suit in a cave with a box of scraps. That's literally what this is, right? He can only do so much with the archaic technology that's available here. But the funny thing is that when Jessica shows up, when the Queen shows up here, she actually starts screwing with the mind of Tony Stark, right? What she says is like, your work on Earth is done, right? Thank you, Tony Stark, for everything that you've accomplished here. And he's like, what in the world are you talking about, right? And her response is, you will go down in our people's history as the greatest soldier the Armada has ever had, and you will always and forever have my undying love, the love of your queen. And where she's trying to convince Tony Stark that he's a Skrull, he refuses to believe that it's true. But here's one of the things to remember. This is him speaking, and it's really him just trying to convince himself. That's the kicker here, right? And again, we'll go more into this process in a future video. But when the Skrulls take on the form of superheroes, it's not just copying them. They believe they're that person. It's one of the things that Tony Stark figured out, right? At the very beginning of the story that we started covering here, it's one of the things that Tony Stark realized when Elektra was revealed to be a Skrull. The reason why her mind couldn't be read by telepaths and they couldn't figure out that she was a Skrull, the reason why she didn't smell like a Skrull to Wolverine is because for all intents and purposes and by all standards of measurement, they are that person, right? They genuinely believe that they are that person. And so when the Queen comes along and uses that information against Tony Stark, it leads Tony Stark down the path of doubting himself. Perhaps I really am a Skrull, which is why he's trying to basically convince himself in saying this as opposed to talking to her. And it's kind of the funny thing because she says, like, you performed admirably, Tony Stark. None of this would have been possible had it not been for you, right? You initiated the superhero civil war. You became director of S.H.I.E.L.D. You're the one that basically ignored the entirety of the Skrulls secretly replacing all of these different superheroes on Earth. Had it not been for you, we never would have been able to pull this off. Now, this conversation is ridiculously important, especially when it comes to the end of Secret Invasion, and then you start going into Dark Reign, which we may or may not cover. I don't know if we're going to do that or not. It's a cool story arc. It's not really an event. It's more of like a branding initiative, but I'll make sense of it once we get closer to the end of Secret Invasion, or once we get to the end of Secret Invasion. But the thing about this is that it's a really, really important conversation here. But in a lot of ways, she's using the history of Tony Stark against him because he did initiate the superhero civil war, and he did become director of S.H.I.E.L.D. And it was under his watch as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. that the Skrulls were secretly replacing superheroes. He was part of the Illuminati. The Illuminati were the ones who went to the Skrull homeworld in the first place and set all this in motion by telling the Skrulls never to visit Earth, right? You remember, when we covered that one shot, the Skrulls had incapacitated the Illuminati and started analyzing their DNA and came to the realization, we can copy their superpowers, right? It's not simply us just taking on their forms. If we explore this possibility long enough, not only can we copy the forms of superheroes on Earth, we can copy their powers, and then we can make it impossible for them to detect the fact that we are Skrulls, right? We can push this to its limit. And so jumping back to Manhattan, back at Times Square where this main event's going on, as you would expect, the initiative is getting absolutely wrecked, right? And the crazy thing about this is that this is all being recorded, it's all being broadcast live on TV. So quite literally, the entirety of the Earth is watching as the superhero superheroes in New York, who are really like the last stand, right? They're the ones that are supposed to keep the world protected. They're getting obliterated by the forces of the Skrulls. Even Vision is destroyed by the Skrulls themselves, because remember, they've been prepping for this war for quite some time. They've been studying the superheroes long enough to know how to overcome their various abilities. So destroying Vision, destroying these other members of the superhero community, all basically seems lost. But in the midst of all of this, everything around the entirety of New York starts to shake. Literally, the whole city starts shaking. And what ends up happening is Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos emerge with Daisy Johnson leading the charge. Now, here's something that I want to solidify here, right? And it's one of the things that I hated the most about Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was a cool show. It was an interesting show. They depowered Quake so bad. It was ridiculous. Daisy Johnson in the comics is stupidly powerful. I mean, she's one of these characters where it's arguable that she's Omega level, because she can literally create earthquakes to the point that she can actually shatter worlds. It's nuts how overpowered she is, right? In the show, I mean, I get the MCU depowers people. That's just the nature of things. It's just how the MCU works, but she was so weak compared to her comic book version. And that's gonna be nuts, because while Nick Fury's team is here and they are gonna put a dent in the Skrulls, even Daisy Johnson's power and her ability to create earthquakes on virtually any scale is not really gonna be enough to turn the tide. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.